whisked away by the cardiovascular system. So pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pineal, and thymus. So we're not going to speak about the pineal gland really. And thymus is really about immune function. Organs with endocrine tissue function, the gonads, pancreas. Can you think of a hormone that pancreas secretes? Kidneys, heart, those are all secreting stuff. Can you think of something the heart is secreting? Natriuretic peptide. Okie dokie. So the flavors that hormones can fall into, really two major categories, those that are steroid in nature and those that are protein in nature. And so amine is something sort of separate there, its own thing. But steroid hormones, I've said this multiple times, that they're synthesized from cholesterol. And so these are hormones that will be produced by the gonads. How many times do I get to say gonad? What do you think? Not as many times as sphincter. No, I don't get to say sphincter. Ooh, that was twice. Deuces. Produced by gonads, placenta, and adrenal glands. And the steroids, because they're lipid in nature, can cross that cell membrane and will bind to an internal cell, or the internal hormone receptor, which is kind of interesting. And then peptide or protein hormones typically will bind to a cell surface receptor. Amine hormones that are synthesized from tyrosine bind to an intracellular receptor, although they have much more of a protein nature, as you might expect. So the synthesis of various hormones, based on what they're made of, peptide hormones are produced by protein synthesis. So peptide and protein, I kind of interchange those words. A lot of times the hormones that are protein in nature are shorter in length. You don't think of something that's 1,000 amino acids long, but something more like 30 and 50. And so the word peptide tends to be used rather than protein, but really, obviously, the same thing, both made of amino acid nature. So they're produced by protein synthesis. You remember protein synthesis? You use DNA and RNA, and then you assemble an amino acid chain. These are made as pre-pro hormones and synthesized as pre-pro hormones. And they're cleaved in the endoplasmic reticulum. So remember there was the SER, or the endoplasmic reticulum that's rough, studded with ribosomes, ribosomal ER. So proteins that are made or translated on that will be squirted directly into the endoplasmic reticulum for tailoring and routing. So these hormones are going to be something that's going to be secreted to the outside. So they'll be routed through the endoplasmic reticulum, and during that time there will be dipping and tucking and such. So they'll be cleaved to a pro-hormone form. And so then they wind up in vesicles and the Golgi apparatus, and then vesicles that are stored near the cell membrane that can be burped out to the exterior when hormone is to be secreted. And so the active hormone is what gets secreted. Just so you remember all those bits of the cell biology that go along, because you want to, I know you do. It's right here. And the way you regulate the manufacture of that is really going to be very easily along that secretory pathway, and that you don't secrete it until the stimulus is there is one way. For steroid hormones, cholesterol is either made by the liver endogenously, or it is uptaken by the small intestine via the diet. And so the synthesis of the steroid hormone is going to be regulated and produced by enzymatic activity on that cholesterol molecule to change it into the steroid hormone, like estrogen, for example. And so they're made all the time, and enzymes can be how you turn on or off the manufacture. Transport, things that are made of protein, peptide, amines, can just be transported either free in the serum or blood, or bound to some sort of carrier molecule. Often that's a very specific carrier molecule for that hormone. For steroids, you know, they're lipids. Steroid, cholesterol, lipid, insoluble. And so they need to have a carrier. And And so the liver is what's really making a lot of those carriers. A lot of them are produced, a lot of them will be carried by albumin, and there are just sort of kind of a generic lot of steroid binding proteins that will carry them around. And so what happens is this allows the lipid or steroid hormone not to be uptaken into a lipoprotein because of its lipid nature, but to remain available to cells so that you can have a useful reservoir of that hormone in this circulation. And so the kind of the half-life, I think this is something important to always think about, because you're certainly doing that in a pharmacological sense. And so hormones are sort of the natural pharmacology for the body. And so how they're eliminated and the half-life of those hormones is really important to how long they are effective in circulation. And so typically something that's steroid is going to have a longer half-life. Its elimination will be slower than something that's peptide in nature or protein in nature. So as far as the target cell, hormones will just be distributed throughout the circulation. It's the point of the target cell to have some sort of receptor or means by which to recognize that hormone and then have a reaction to it. And so receptors are either on the cell surface for a protein hormone, or they're intracellular for a steroid hormone, or also the amine hormone. And so how that is, this is very much like pharmacology, is how does it, what's the effectiveness of that hormone for its target cell, and that's going to depend on how much hormone is available in the blood, the affinity of that molecule for its receptor, and the number of receptors available as well. And so that's very much how drugs really work. So you can think of hormones in that same sort of way. Mechanism of action, how your hormones affect change or stimulation of that target cell. Membrane permeability or membrane potential can be changed, and then that would create some sort of influx or gate for other particles to come in. It can change the synthesis of the production of a protein or a regulatory molecule, which will affect that production. It can activate or deactivate an enzyme. You see that a lot. That's really quick. That's a real quick little switch. It can induce secretory activity, so induction of secretion of another hormone or a product, cell product, or stimulate mitosis to increase the growth of some sort of cell on the other end. So all of those things, hormones can do any of those things. One of the things that, we just kind of keep seeing those bits and pieces here and there. But this second messenger system, where a hormone, it's being received by a receptor and then telling the cell, that stimulates the cell to have something go on. So the hormone would be the first messenger, and some sort of intracellular stimulation would act as second messenger. A lot of times that second messenger will be cyclic AMP. And I'm not going to be concerned, or really anywhere along the way, where you have to know what hormone and what second messenger go together. But I think generically it's really important to know that this is how you stimulate differences in the target cell, is by activation or deactivation of the amount of cyclic AMP. So the way that works is one of these G protein coupled receptors. I use the capital letter R for receptor. A G protein coupled receptor means there's a hormone receptor, some sort of protein in nature bound to the cell membrane, and in connection with that would be a G protein. So we say that's a G protein coupled receptor. And so what then happens, and this next slide will have this picture a little bit bigger, although it's probably easier for you to see that. The GDP is associated with that G protein. That's why it gets the name G, because GDP is associated with it. When the receptor binds its target, a conformational change happens. That GDP can dissociate, and GTP can be bound to that protein. So GTP is a lot like ATP. Energy will be generated when you then lyse that bond between that third phosphate and the rest the molecule, and that energy can be driven to do something. And so that happens, cleavage of the GTP occurs, and then that allows the activation of adenylate cyclase. That's the enzyme that's in the membrane that will help create cyclic AMP. And so then that goes on to do something. Cyclic AMP will activate kinases. Kinases are generic, and that's a generic name for an enzyme which will phosphorylate another protein. And so this will be specific to what needs to be phosphorylated. Phosphorylation of a protein will be either activated or deactivated. Are you super excited about all that? Let's just get to the part where people feel tired because they don't have enough thyroid hormone. And then cyclic AMP is degenerated by phosphodiesterases. So you're hearing a lot, even on television, about PDEs, phosphodiesterases, which are a large group of hormones. They're numbered with different things. So I was watching something, probably a documentary to stimulate my mind. Probably not Bravo. But there was some, it was for patients to ask for a chemotherapeutic agent with their doctor, which I think is really interesting, that you would go in and ask your doctor for a specific chemotherapeutic agent. But this is, this is how it's marketed, and you do have to be your own advocate. But it was saying if you have a PDE4 receptor positive or something like that, cancer. So anyway, when you hear PDE, it simply means phosphodiesterase, and these are degrading cyclic AMP. And so the whole point of any of that is that cells have cyclic AMP so often as one of those things that can turn on and off activities. And so it's a second messenger that's used by a lot of hormones. There's one. There's an example of a second messenger. Here's a bigger picture. G protein coupled receptor. G protein activates adenylate cyclase. And then you have an increase in cyclic AMP being produced. See how that AMP, ADP, ATP, GTP, those are all very little, used over and over and over, recycled little molecules in the cell. And in this case, you're activating a protein kinase, which will then go on and phosphorylate and activate or deactivate some sort of protein activity. Another mechanism of action of hormones, which bind to receptors and work through a second messenger, is the Ip3 D Ag system. And so that's another common second messenger system that you keep kind of hearing about and running across. And so I'm trying to describe to you as ways hormones affect their activity. And then we'll get to some specific hormones. GPCRG protein coupled receptor. So that's the same thing as the G protein that we saw with the cyclic AMP activation. But when that becomes, you bind the hormone, activate the G protein portion of that receptor, you'll split phosphatidylinositol, or PIP2, which is part of the membrane. So these things are all acting in neighbors with each other. And so I think this is one of the whole points I want you to get, is that there's a cell interior. How do we activate that cell to do something when all we do is we have a knock at the door? That protein hormone is staying outside in the receptor, but it's affecting the whole 3-dimension of that cell. And how do you do that while you're staying up there? You send something from the membrane into the cell interior. That's acting as a second messenger. So it's cute there that these things, that adenylate cyclase and this PIP2 are in the cell membrane, and then you activate something that can go south or into the cell interior. So, it's a lovely little pathway. You get lost in the details because you can, either you love the details or you hate them. I think most people don't like them, especially at this point in the game. But the whole overall picture is, how are you giving someone something or injecting a hormone around and it's making internal changes in a cell? And this is one way. And so when you split PIP2, you get 2 molecules. One is DAG, which is diacylglycerol, and it will go activate protein kinases. So that's another similar system like cyclic AMP will do that. And then the Ip3, or the inositol triphosphate, will help increase the calcium that's on the interior of a cell from its release, binding calmodulin, activating enzymes. So two pivotal ions in interior cell activation are calcium and phosphate. And so we just have to have a way of sending that signal from the wall of that cell to the interior of the cell. And so these processes are pretty similar, you know, there's so much similarity from cell to cell, but it's then what's actually going to be activated in this process, and that gets super complicated. And then you go through and you deactivate these protein kinases and PIP and all these things to downregulate that activity. And then there's that same picture, but bigger. So that's something that's a protein hormone or protein in nature, and it has a cell membrane associated receptor specific to that hormone. If it's the other class of hormones, they're steroid in nature, they're lipid in nature, they can cross the cell membrane. Now they've been carried around bound to some carrier molecule or protein, and a cleavage will occur such that the hormone itself enters the cell, and look what it really does. It goes and attaches to an intracellular receptor that can be cytoplasmic or nuclear, and that thing will go and affect DNA and will affect then transcription and in turn protein synthesis, and it will either click protein manufacture up or down. So often, this is so cute too. So if you're wanting to block the transcription of a gene, and if you transcribe a gene, you end up with messenger RNA and you end up with translation producing proteins. So if you want to, if you're a cell that doesn't want to make something, it's nice to set something and block that gene transcription. And a lot of these cellular receptors will do that. And when they bind their steroid hormone, it will lift them off, and that will increase then the ability of that gene to get transcribed. So that's the kind of thing that gets me super excited, but I understand as I'm looking out upon your faces that it is not your necessarily same reaction. But the point is we're talking about hormones, how do they work, and it goes to just the nature of that hormone, and really, it really does go to when you remove that hormone, what's the part of the process that's not working? What's the part then that you get dysfunction as a result of that? So, steroid hormones alter gene transcription and therefore protein manufacture. Now the amine hormones, it's really, thyroid hormone is sort of, it's one that we're really talking about, also the catecholamines. They have an intracellular receptor and they act a little bit differently, so we'll leave those off. So how do you feedback hormone control, or how do you control hormone release? And there are two ways: positive feedback, negative feedback. Negative feedback is the primary use, where when you induce the manufacture and release of a hormone, it is that hormone itself that feeds back to decrease its own production. That's negative feedback. We have a couple of examples of positive feedback where production of that hormone will elicit more production of that hormone. And so, in this little specific example, I think it's oxytocin probably, if it's even up there as an example, but we'll get to that. Ordinarily, feedback systems will be negative. Okay, let's talk about the brain. Yay! It's Monday. Remember brain? Okay, so there were those two big chunks, those hemispheres, the cerebrums. Remember those? Okay. And then inside you had this midbrain and a brainstem and a spinal cord. You're there now. All right, so inside that you had thalamus. Remember I always said when in doubt, answer thalamus. The other is when in doubt, and if it's an option, I answer hypothalamus. So hypothalamus exists in that midbrain, just inferior and slightly anterior to the thalamus. And it sits really right where that optic chiasm is, and just above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is tasting blood that's full strength. So there's a blood-brain barrier that is a really tight net that won't allow large molecules to pass. Except for the blood that serves the hypothalamus. It's a little more lenient. It's a little bit more of a normal capillary bed, not as restrictive. And this is cool because the hypothalamus can constantly taste real blood and know what levels of things are there. And that's why it's considered just really a major control center. It's connecting the brain to the blood, whereas thalamus is connecting the brain to the nerves. And so in this way, I just got like a real nerd chill. I'm not even kidding. Those are so fun. Hair, stand up. Calm down, girls. So, introduction to endocrinology is that you have this way to systemically control the body with hormones. The other way we sort of systemically control the bodies with nerves, and we see this linkage right here, even anatomically, which is so lovely. Hypothalamus, homeostatic center for chemistry and temperature of internal environment. So, you know, it's tasting full strength blood is how I like to do it. Acting with the limbic system and controlling awareness, intellectual behavior, emotional behavior, and then all of the set points that need to be controlled. And it's going to control the pituitary gland. That's where we're concerned with here. So there is the hypothalamic, hypophyseal tract. So the pituitary gland is the hypophysis, or the apophysis. And so there is a tract between physical connection between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Well, that's cute because they're really situated physically right there together. You see the pituitary gland with the infundibulum, or the stalk. And then it has two lobes, an anterior and a posterior lobe of the pituitary. And so the hypothalamus will be controlling both of these lobes, but in two completely different ways. And so for the posterior lobe of the pituitary, there is a neural connection. So nerves from the hypothalamus run from the hypothalamus directly along that infundibulum to the posterior pituitary gland. There are a couple of nuclei as part of the hypothalamus that will send nerve tracts to the posterior posterior pituitary gland. One is the supraoptic nuclei, so called because they are just above the optic chiasm. Supraoptic nuclei will send neurons to the posterior pituitary, which will then release the hormone ADH. You've heard of that one before, also known as vasopressin. The other set of the other neural tract from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary originates in the paraventricular nuclei, so named for their location along that nuclei. And they will, are you supposed to work out now?
I don't know. I turn it off.
Do you let your phone boss you around? That's awesome. Okay, and Siri is a man. My Siri is a man, just so you know. He calls me queen of the world. Because some men should. Other than Paul. Can it just tell you stuff like that? I didn't know it can just tell you stuff like that. I need to have mine just say, you're awesome. You're awesome, nerd. I mean, queen of the world. Okay, so that's posterior pituitary. So that is called the hypothalamic, hypophyseal tract. And there it is again, the same picture but bigger. So you see the supraoptic nuclei with their neural extensions directly to that posterior lobe. So you see where the chiasm is and you see where posterior is. And and then the paraventricular nuclei. And so, the posterior pituitary hormones are produced by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. That's not the case for anterior pituitary. It's a little more, it's a little more indirect. It is the hypophyseal portal system. So when you hear the word portal, you're thinking it's some sort of blood transit. And it is. It's a vascular pathway from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus in this case will actually make hormones, release them. They will be picked up by the surrounding hypothalamic capillary beds and run or be distributed in a vascular way to the anterior pituitary. Those hormones will say, okay, now release your hormone, and the anterior pituitary will manufacture and release hormones. So neurons of the ventral hypothalamus release hypophysiotropic hormones, or releasing hormones, that will then be transported to the anterior pituitary to stimulate release of hormones. It's pretty well named. And here's just a little picture. Now this is reversed, but from the last picture, so the anterior pituitary is on this other side. So always, look at your landmarks when you look at a picture, and obviously it's pretty important. You have to know right from left, stuff like that. I would always walk out of a patient's room and then imagine the patient laying there, which was right and left. That's just, I would always do this sort of analog flip to help me remember. So you'll have your own way. It'll be easy for some of you just to remember, oh yeah, that was the right side, because I don't know. It's just you have your own way, but you have to get it right. True? You really, really do. When you're taking a patient in for surgery, I know that. And then I worked in one hospital, and they would have me put an X on the non-operative appendage, which is
So they are more specific, because an X is not good enough. They want the patient actually right out right or left.
on the body, on their own body. Yeah, I think that's fine. Also it's a little mini mental status exam for your patient. You can see how you're doing, how you doing. So here are some of those releasing hormones that the thalamus will release to that portal tract to the anterior pituitary. Corticotropic releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone, do you see there's a pattern here? Growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the release of growth hormone, yeah. Do you love Jamie on those, I watch a lot of TV, I guess. Jamie on those, what's the insurance with the Progressive? I just felt like Jamie right then for a minute, and then I realized that I should have said that out loud. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also called somatostatin, will inhibit growth hormone release. Here's some more. Gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary. There are two flavors of those, LH and FSH. Prolactin releasing hormone stimulates prolactin release. And then there is a prolactin inhibiting hormone as well. And then look, here's a little picture. So really, I think it's easier to recall all the anterior pituitary hormones, because they're the ones that are really getting that's the business end of this whole thing. And they're the ones going and telling another organ to release hormones, basically. And so the hypothalamus is really acting as the master, or to assist in all that with releasing hormones. Here's just another little picture to show you, oh look, hypothalamus makes a hormone, sends that to the anterior pituitary, which makes a hormone, which circulates to its target, which makes a hormone. So it's a cascade, really, of hormone production. Typically all with negative feedback. So the time you get down to that end user kind of hormone, it will feed back and inhibit the hypothalamus. So cute. Let's look at the pituitary gland, the hypophysis. There are two portions, the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis. or in other words, posterior and anterior pituitary gland lobes. They reach, there's a good bit of pituitary gland pathology, and they, neurosurgeons can reach the pituitary gland. It's very deep. That'd be a mess to get to, but it's super close to the nose, the back of the nose, so at transsphenoidal surgery. Remember that sphenoid when in doubt? Sphenoid. They can just go right through that. And hopefully it seals, or you'll have someone with a CSF leak with a chronic runny nose. And these are just things to, keep in mind along the way. My nose is always running, especially when I bend over. Yeah. A headache along with it. But that sounds so sinus. It'd be easy to let that go for a while, unless you did a smear of it, which they do in allergy clinics. One of the first things they do is a smear of your snot. Anyway, so let's look at the anterior pituitary of the pituitary gland. There are a couple of cell types. Like with everything, it's not all just one thing. There are secretory cells. Those are trope cells, which will make or release hormones. So they're granulated. Remember, that's just the thing. If you have big old vesicles full of hormone, then when you look at that cell, even with a light microscope, like you've used in microbiology, you can see granules because it's so loaded with its product. And then the folliculostellate cells, which are going to be those sort of assistant cells that help regulate the growth and function. So you almost always have populations like that that are kind of nurse cells or look like satellite cells, but they do somehow affect the functioning or business cells. Here are some examples of names of cell types. And so they're all pretty similar to the thing that they release. So the anterior pituitary is releasing a lot of hormones, among them growth hormone, prolactin, ACTH, the gonadotropins. And so there's a cell type specific for that produces that single kind of hormone, and they have names that are pretty similar. So somatotropes, somato is always referring to really the whole body, and we think of growth hormone with that. So the somatotrope is the hormone, cell type that releases growth hormone. But look, half of all of the cells are that. And so that's pretty interesting, super important for growth, but it is released cyclically and daily throughout life, and with a decreased amount or diminished amount of that with time. Gonadotropes are about 20% of the anterior pituitary producing FSH and LH. So just an idea of, that distribution of cells. It's not, it's random. It's not random, I guess. It's just various. So let's look specifically at ACTH manufacture. So we're looking at each of the hormones now. The corticotrope cells will produce ACTH, and it starts by making this compound, pro-opiomelanocortin, POMC. And I really only mention that here because I think you might run into POMC as years to come, as time goes on, because it's one of these big precursor molecules that a lot of things come from. Like in that, it's not super popular now, but that arachidonic acid, that whole system of things, or when you look at cholesterol and all of the different hormones that come from that, I think this might be one of these that we see a little bit more of in the literature in time. And you'll always be doing CME. So you have, and those are pretty complicated, CMEs really, because it's written by someone who's an expert in the field, and so there's always, and should be, peer journal reviewed sort of information there that is technical. So anyway, so you take this big old honking molecule and then it gets cleaved into a variety of things. And one of the things that it gets made into is this ACTH, which is the hormone from the anterior pituitary that I'm interested in. But look, there's other things that get made from that. So I will just mention here, endorphins also get made from that. And then some of these fragments can be made into MSHs. There are different varieties of those. And those are melanocyte-stimulating hormones. And so that may or may not go to melanogenesis, the production of melanin. But there are some fields of newer study, I think, or newer to me anyway, where MSHs, when they are in blood in numbers, they do things like reduce glucose or maybe are anti-inflammatory. And how much melanogenesis or stimulation of melanocytes is there is kind of up for debate. But anyway, it seems that MSHs are out there and they're being made by a variety of cells. The brain is releasing very little. But I just wanted to mention this molecule from and so there are lots of molecules that we use different parts of that to differentially. ACTH is the goal here. ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. What would be your guess about what gland? All of these will be going to some other gland. What's the gland that ACTH is going to go to? Adrenal gland, and it will stimulate the adrenal gland to make corticotropins. So it's adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's really well named. But we hate to say all that, so we say ACTH. ACTH will be produced and released by the anterior pituitary, and its target will be the adrenal glands. So for every hormone, I think it's important for you to always have this. Where is it coming from? What's the stimulus for that release? What is its target, and what is its effect on the target cell? Because this really goes to how you look at dysfunction. So where is the dysfunction if somebody has hypothyroidism, for example? There's a cascade of hormones there. A releasing hormone, or just in this case, corticotropins. A releasing hormone, and then the hormone. So where is the dysfunction? So it's always important to know what this pathway. Corticotropic cells of the anterior pituitary will release ACTH. It will circulate and target the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of glucocorticoids. So whenever there is a hormone that comes from cholesterol, the manufacturer of that hormone will create isoforms. And so we say estrogens. There are forms of testosterone. For corticosteroids, we say it plural. But the number one flavor that you really see and that's functional is cortisol. So don't let that bug you. It just means that cholesterol, there are isoforms manufactured from it. So it's not the same as insulin, where probably there are some isoforms of insulin that you'll be studying about at some point. But it's really a protein that's manufactured by gene manufacture. A gene, a protein. But here you're taking, do you see that difference? That you're taking an existing compound and you're tweaking it, and therefore you get slight differences from one to the next. So anyway, we see this because it always bothered me. If it's cortisol, why do we ever use the word glucocorticoids? And so it's because there are a little bit of flavors along the way. The cortisol, what's the function of cortisol? And that is that thing that peaks when you wake up in the morning and starts to get your blood sugar up to a good amount so that you can begin to function. And other things as well. So here's an example of what it does. It's stimulatory to metabolism, really, in a way. It's inhibited in a feedback control system. ACTH is inhibited by cortisol, so that end product will feedback and inhibit ACTH from whence it was stimulated. Another anterior pituitary hormone is growth hormone. It's produced by a cell type in the anterior pituitary called the somatotrope. There are 5 actual genes for it, so, which is interesting. How important growth hormone is that 50% of all the cells in the anterior pituitary that secrete hormone will secrete it, and you have 5 genes to make sure it gets produced. So it's extremely important in stimulating growth and body maintenance. And so it works so well, we rarely see any problem with growth hormone in the long run. When you do, it's a very obvious problem. Probably there'll be, in your career lifetime, there will be a lot of subsets of diagnoses that involve different amounts of growth hormone, I'll betcha. But it is transported in the blood with an extracellular GH receptor, which is cute. Its own little receptor is what it's bound to, so free receptor. And that's a cute way of doing it. It's just a way of having one gene, two functions. It's produced in response to hypothalamic GHRH. You know, I didn't say that on this one, did I? Oh yeah, okay. So for all the anterior pituitary hormones, there is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So for ACTH, there was hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone, which I don't think I said out loud. So for growth hormone, there is a hypothalamic growth hormone, releasing hormone, comes from hypothalamus, goes along that hypophyseal portal tract, tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And it's pulsatile over lifetime as well as daily. So that's one of the things people get injected with for anabolism and such, is growth hormone. And I feel like I can see it. Do you ever see people on television? And obviously I'm referring, that's like my third reference to television. Or you'll see pictures of people that look bigger and better than they should at their age. I'm specifically thinking of Sylvester Stallone, but there's a lot of them. And I'm not sure if they're getting facial surgery or that growth hormone is really making their jaw and nose grow. They have a thickened sort of face and skin, I don't know. Anyway, so you can just go out there and look at old actors and make your own judgment. I don't know. That's a really useful thing to say. Let's go on. Anterior pituitary, what does it do? Causes stuff to grow. Bone and muscle are two of the big places that growth hormone will affect. When you think about a little kid growing, so it's going to stimulate mitosis, it's going to stimulate all the uptake of nutrients that will help a cell anabolize or manufacture proteins and stuff. So increasing uptake of amino acids, increasing protein synthesis, increasing uptake of sulfur, that's good for cartilage growth and maintenance. Lipolysis is that clipping of triglycerides and fatty acids and releasing the two-component ketone-like bodies to the blood for use as fuel, maintaining blood sugar levels, and increases somatomedin, ILG production. Let's see, I think I have that on this next one. Somatomedins are produced by the liver, and they are insulin-like growth factors. And I don't know if you've heard much about them yet, but you certainly will. So they have these, they're numbered, IGL, that's supposed to be a 1, IGL2, and so forth. But they have growth hormone anabolic-like effects, so they're called insulin-like growth factors. So seem like they enhance insulin activity, where a lot of growth hormone will decrease insulin-like activity. So you just get a little bit of everything going on. And I think this is a picture that kind of helps with that a good bit. So here's growth hormone being produced by the anterior pituitary. You see that? And it will affect liver and other tissues and to produce these insulin-like growth factors, and you get a whole host of results there. But will have a direct effect on fat for lipolysis and carbohydrate metabolism and metabolism generally of cells. So you get a wide range of effects from growth hormone, and some of those are being created by insulin-like growth factor. And all of that stimulated by release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So you need all that going on during growth from the time that you're using a hormone like that somewhere. I don't really know at what point growth hormone, I should look that up, feel at what point that's making a big difference in stimulating mitosis. But anyway, certainly important through growth and then throughout life for maintenance. It's inhibited by somatostatin, which comes from the hypothalamus itself. And also other things will feed back and inhibit, like growth hormone, which is a classic negative feedback. Cortisol will inhibit growth hormone, and then the somatomines, which are the IGLs. And here's a lot of stuff that will increase its secretion and stuff that will decrease its secretion. And I just think that's kind of interesting. You don't have to know these or anything, but just what increases, why would, it's not constitutively released, so, and it's not like it's just released through childhood growth. It gets released through life by certain stimulus. And just to grab one, pyrogen, so those things that induce temperature or heat, so the inflammatory process, it makes a lot of pyrogens. It'll affect the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus to release growth hormone, releasing hormone, to release growth hormone, and to cause repair. And so that just makes sense. It's cute. So there are various things that will do that. Going to sleep, so growth hormone through the night, and then cortisol begins to increase, and you'll decrease growth hormone during the day. So sleep has an important restorative, for real. You'll get some of it someday. You might be my age by the time it happens, but you're going to love it. I'm telling you, you're going to love sleep. You don't know about sleep yet. You're going to get sleep. You still have babies at home, Professor Reggio, so you don't know about sleep. I sleep for you, trust me. I sleep so much. You sleep through the night, though, yeah. It still's not enough sleep, is it? Oh, God, sometimes I cannot wait for my nap. Oh. And now I'm just bragging. Yeah. But at some point, you'll remember how awesome sleep is. But be sure you get it, really. Make it a priority. Okay, how about a little breaky break? All right.